All right, in this lecture, we are going to consider arguably the most famous set of brother and sister, in this case, fraternal twins in the Greek pantheon. Not the only set of twins, Apollo and Artemis. And so we'll start with looking at Apollo, but the pairing of Apollo and Artemis is a really interesting one, and also a very they represent a kind of common push-pull tension. I think I may have mentioned this earlier in the class, talking about it when we saw Athena and Poseidon conducting that contest over who was going to be the patron deity of Athens. And I think I suggested to you that we might see Athena in that case as the goddess on the side of civilization, and Poseidon as a god of kind of pure nature, coming into tension with each other. Now, again, this doesn't mean that they are not necessarily enemies with each other. In fact, I think in many ways quite the opposite. But they represent kind of these polar sides that are both kind of drawn toward each other, but also kind of repel each other at the same time. And I think, as a rule of thumb, if you ever reading a myth, I mean, it doesn't have to be a Greek story. It could be a religious story. It can be a fantasy story. Very often, when you have twins, they will often, one twin will represent civilization and the other twin will represent kind of the wildness of nature. And sometimes they're in tension, but sometimes they are also kind of brought together. They're kind of two halves of the same whole. So if you think of the characterization of like Jacob and Esau, twins in biblical literature, or even Luke and Leia in the Star Wars legends, you start to see maybe a little bit of what I'm getting at. So Apollo and Artemis too, they are brother and sister. They are not enemies. There's actually very little mythology in which they act together. But when they do, they are in concert as siblings. But I think they represent themes that are larger than themselves. But we start with Apollo, a really interesting god. He's right up there in my book with a goddess like Athena, in kind of the number of things that he's associated with. He's got a wide expanse of associations. He's got associations with light. He's sometimes called a sun god, although in Greek mythology usually it's Helios. The sun itself takes on that role, but he does have associations with light and sunlight, music, healing, also disease. Interestingly enough, his arrows from his bow and arrow, he is famously the archer deity, are associated with the onslaught of disease. Poetry, purification. He's one of the few gods that can help you if you run into extreme dire straits. That if you are guilty of murder, and there's no way to kind of wash that guilt off you, Apollo is kind of your god of last resort. So we see this happens with figures like Orestes and Heracles, as we'll see down the line. And also, probably most famously in terms of kind of Greek history, he was the principal oracle deity. His famous oracle at Delphi, which we'll spend some time looking at and talking about, was the principal kind of oracle site where one could travel and put a question to the god and receive an answer, just like we saw with Zeus in his sanctuary at Dodona. He's also, as a god of civilization, he's also for the Greeks a supreme representator of rationality. The Greeks, like we see that tension between civilization and nature. That is also, we could extend that in kind of a tension between rationality and irrationality. So, like Athena, as a goddess of the city, is a very rational deity. She comes in tension with Poseidon, who is a god of wildness and irrationality. And Apollo is a god of the kind of rationality that the Greeks really prized in their development of their philosophy and their logic. And their rationality is often embodies itself in a control of one's emotions. So here we see a couple of photos of this famous statue group called the Apollo Belvedere. It's now in the Vatican museums outside of Rome. You see the detail of the head of Apollo. So here he's depicted as an archer deity, which is Apollo in his most dangerous guise. You can see that his bow is broken, but you see his quiver. He would have been maybe reaching for an arrow or grabbing an arrow here. So he's maybe even in the process of doing something dangerous, something violent, but you see the expression on his face is one of just complete passive, cool, calm reserve, extremely rational, even in the face of doing something perhaps more wild and dangerous. And so there's clearly a kind of a tension between those two, and so I think the sculptor is exploring that tension even within the persona of Apollo. He's got a famous birth story. So Apollo and his twin sister Artemis are born on this tiny little island of Delos. The Powell book recounts this myth. I'll just recount it briefly here. The brother and sister are the product of one of Zeus's many affairs. Here he has an affair with a minor goddess named Leto, and Hera, of course, gets upset, as she always does, and rightfully so. And Hera, as a goddess of childbirth, goes around from place to place and island to island and says, do not allow, if Leto comes along begging for a place to be taken in and to give birth, do not let her in, or suffer my wrath. And so Leto goes from place to place, and the idea is that she's in this prolonged, excruciating labor, because nobody, out of fear of Hera, will allow her to pause and to actually give birth, until she arrives on this tiny little island of Delos. And the way the story is usually told is that it's a loophole in Hera's curse. Hera said that any land placed on the mainland or a fixed island that allowed Leto to give birth would be cursed by her. But there was an old mythic tradition that Delos was not a fixed island. It actually, the idea was it floated around from place to place like a boat, or floating like a piece of wood. And so Delos escapes that curse of Hera. And it's this tiny little 2-square-mile island. It's a real place, where Apollo and Artemis are finally born. And thereafter, that island of Delos was famous for a sanctuary dedicated to the twins. Now, he has a number of names in Greek literature, as we saw with Athena and others. One of the very difficult things about studying and mastering Greek mythology is that there are so many names, and there are so many nicknames, and so many little epithets that apply to these deities that it can be very confusing. I would take these to be what I take to be the principal one. The one on the top, just like with Pallas, with Athena, Phoebus. If you see Phoebus, that invariably refers to Apollo. At root, we don't really know, I believe, what the means. Most people think that the pho there is probably the same root in Greek as photo, like photos, which means light. Like photography literally means light writing. And so Phoebus might be a name that attached to him because of his early associations with the sun and light. So you'll still run into the feminine version of this name today. Phoebe is just the feminine version of this. So I've met a number of Phoebes in my life, but I've yet to meet a Phoebus. Other nicknames, see something called Loxian Apollo, which probably means something like fox-like, crafty, difficult, hard to understand. Sometimes this was applied to him as an oracle deity. It's really interesting in literature, like in stories, in non-historical stories, fictional stories, where Apollo's oracle figures, his oracles are often tricky. They're kind of riddling, and often the twist is that the person interpreting the oracle interprets it wrong, to his or her own detriment. While in what we know from historical reality is that the Oracle of Delphi was actually gave very reasonable, practical, and easy to digest advice. So I just find that I note that for its because it's interesting. That there's this narrative kind of fictional persona of the Oracle, this Loxian a persona in the Oracle, and a very different one on the ground. A couple of just kind of place nomers. Delphian refers to the Apollo of Delphi, his oracle place. Delian, you'll sometimes see that when the author wants to emphasize his association with his sister from Delos. Apollo in Homer is Homer calls him the Far Striker. As the emphasizes his role as the archer, and particularly his arrows, which represent disease. There's a scene early in the Iliad where Apollo comes down from Olympus firing his arrows of disease at the Greeks and causing a plague. And in fact, we still have a little remnant in our own language that reminds us of this very thing. So the word for the bow in ancient Greek is toxos, and so the toxos with a capital T or capital tau in Greek would be the bow of Apollo. And so when we use the word toxic, it literally means coming from the bow of Apollo. So a little kind of etymological reminder, a little referent within the language we still use of this famous association. Now, to arguably Apollo's most famous role in historical Greece. His oracle at the city of Delphi. Now, Delphi, we know from archaeological exploration, was a place that was long held sacred by the Greeks. It probably was very sacred to other deities, probably many deities now since lost to memory, before Apollo had his oracle established there. And so there's lots of stories about Delphi. One famous story for the Greeks told was that Delphi was the center of the world. Zeus wanted to find out where the center of the world was, believing that place would hold special power. So he sent an eagle from the west side of the universe over here, and he sent an eagle from the east side of the universe and had them fly towards each other. And where they met was right over Mount Parnassus, where on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, probably in terms of the sacredness of mountains, Parnassus is sacred only to Mount Olympus, which is up here. This was marked a very, very special and important place. Now, in Greek literature, Apollo quickly becomes associated with this place. And so there's a story where Apollo is one of these deities, kind of a second generation Olympian. He's kind of eternally youthful, beardless. It's rare to find a bearded depiction of Apollo. And so there's a story as a young god kind of making his name. He's going around looking for a place to establish his main sanctuary. And he comes to the slopes of Parnassus, and there he finds this large snake, the Pytho, which we get our word python from, that he slays. And then the body of the Pytho rots and disintegrates into the ground. There's some wordplay going on here. Putho in ancient Greek sounds like the verb which means to rot. And so the snake does what its name implies that it should do. And by killing the snake, he now has control of the area and establishes his oracle there. Now, some scholars have thought there might be more than meets the eye going on in this story, that the snake might represent maybe an earlier kind of earth-based cult. The snake is such a complex symbol in many mythologies around the world, so it's really hard to pin it down. But one of the things that the snake can represent is kind of the regenerative power of the earth. And so the Pytho might represent kind of an earth goddess, perhaps, that was in charge of that sanctuary. And then along comes Apollo, slays the snake, and in so doing kind of gets rid of conquers the goddess that was there and takes it over for himself. I mean, there is a theory, it's kind of out of favor these days, that the pantheon before the Olympians come along, which is very masculine based, it's centered around a sky god, was matriarchal, centered around an earth goddess. And maybe this story illustrates a masculine deity coming in and getting rid of the earlier matriarchal cult. It's an intriguing idea. Like I said, it's out of favor these days, I think, just because it's hard to prove. But it's a very tantalizing idea, and may give us an idea of perhaps what was at Delphi before Apollo's oracle was there. Here we see him depicted on a coin with some of his prime symbols. The laurel branch is kind of his tree, familiar in the natural world. Here we see the lyre as a god of music. And then a couple of symbols that are particularly associated with Delphi. We see this bronze tripod. It's maybe hard to see, but it's kind of a bronze cauldron with these three legs. This was a symbol that was widely associated with Delphi for reasons we'll see in a moment. And then he's sitting on this rounded stone, which the Greeks called an omphalos. An omphalos is just the ancient Greek word for the belly button, the navel. And the belief was that Delphi was the center of the world. It was the omphalos of the world. It was the belly button, the very center. And so that's what Apollo's sitting on here to remind us of that fact. Now here, Delphi is an extraordinarily beautiful place. I always tell my classes it's the most beautiful, kind of spine-tingling place I've ever been in my life. I've been there a number of times, and it never fails just to make my jaw drop. And when you're standing there, and I hope some of these pictures give you a little bit of taste of that, you can see why the Greeks would have considered it or associated with things sacred. So when you approach the shrine, as in antiquity, just like you do today, just like at Dodona, lots of other gods and goddesses want to get in on the action. So the first place you would have stopped was at this round, what they call a Tholos-style temple, and this is dedicated to Athena. Athena is a goddess of civilization, a fine partner to Apollo. You would pay your respects to various gods along the way, Athena here, before you got to the main event of the Temple of Apollo on the Oracle site. Now, I'll show you a few pictures of what it looks like, but here's a blueprint so that Temple of Athena was called the Temple of Athena Pronaos, which means the Temple of Athena kind of before you get to the shrine, the main shrine. And the main reason people, of course, visited Delphi was to consult the oracle. It was not open. It was not a 24/7 kind of thing. It was only open, just like at Dodona, certain days of the year. So you had to plan your visit accordingly and deal with the crowds that would be there. But once you came there was a set ritual that you went through. You purified yourself in a stream that cascaded down the mountain just around here. You offered up a sacred cake. In later years, the oracle became big business, and to say if you were someone as a delegation of a city-state, you were expected to kind of buy a ticket to consult the oracle. You had to dedicate a gift, you had to give gold, you had to give a statue, you had to dedicate a tripod, and only thereafter, if your gift was accepted, were you allowed to consult the oracle. I'll show you some evidence of that. But once all of that was along the way, you would make your way up kind of the switchback, the Via Sacra, the sacred way, and you would make your way up to the Temple Mount here. Now, there's some question about exactly what the procedure was, but roughly speaking, it's unlikely that questioners were allowed inside the center cella of the temple. You probably were met at the door by a priest, and they accepted your gift, your small offering, if you're an individual. And you gave your question to the priest, and the priest would walk back to this back room here that I've highlighted, which was a kind of holy of holies of the temple. And back there, a priestess called the Pythia. She, like Pytho, she carries on that name, perhaps even from that earlier cult, maybe that preceded Apollo. And she was an older woman in her 50s, had long been part of the cult. And she became a kind of medium for the oracle. She sat in a tripod in one of those big bronze bowls, elevated above the ground, and some sources say that there was a kind of a crack in the earth, a crack in the floor of the temple, and from that crack in the earth, vapors arose. And there, again, some geological exploration has suggested there may have been kind of a natural vent for natural gas right back here, and maybe one of the reasons why the Greeks recognized it as sacred. They couldn't explain it in scientific terms, but they knew that when they walked in this area and they inhaled the fumes, perhaps they felt woozy, or they got a little high, you might say, and they explained that in divine terms instead of scientific terms. So maybe perhaps what happened, that was going on there. But the Pythia perhaps inhaled these fumes, and then what would happen is the priest would read the question to her, and she would shriek forth in a kind of babblings, kind of a speaking in tongues. And the priests were said to be trained to interpret those tongues, and then they would come back to the front, and they would interpret the tongues of the Pythia to give you your answer. So the idea is that the Pythia was a medium. Apollo, the god, would inhabit her, would possess her, and would give forth his answer in these shriekings, and then they were interpreted for the answer, for the questioner. And so, like I said, in the historical examples of answers and questions that survive, and quite a number do, the oracle was famous for giving actually fairly straightforward, fairly practical advice. This was an oracle that lasted hundreds, if close to 1,000 years, over 1,000 years. And if it didn't give good advice, it wouldn't have lasted as kind of a cultural institution. Here's an artist rendering of what the site may have looked like at its height here. This is roughly kind of follows that same blueprint I just showed you. Walking up the sacred way, around the bend, up to the Temple Mount, and then into the kind of foyer here. And then back here is where the Pythia would have sat to give forth her prophecies. And you can see along the way there were all these little mini buildings, these little kind of mini temples here, just like at Olympia. City-states would dedicate these what they call treasuries, and they would leave gifts of gold in thanks to the god for providing advice and giving the answers that would help foster their city-state. And there were all these little things along the way up on the mount here, lots of statues. Here's a big bronze tripod that became a popular gift to kind of mimic the tripod that the Pythia was sitting on back here. So like Olympia, over time it became an extremely embellished and very, very wealthy site because of all the gifts given there. Here's a few pictures of what it looks like today. So this is Mount Parnassus, and so the whole sanctuary is built kind of on this slope up to the top of the mountain here. And when you look off in this direction, you're looking at this giant valley with millions upon millions of olive trees. On a clear day, you can see the sea in the distance. It's absolutely breathtaking. But here's kind of the bottom of the switchback as you would make your way up here, and here's a few columns that remain on the foundation of the temple of Apollo here, where the oracle sat back in this area here. Here's just a shot, because this is actually at the very top of the site, where if you go above the site, above the theater, and you keep walking up the switchback up into the forest, and you're getting kind of closer and closer to the top of the mountain, what you find there, you can see some of the seating here. There's a full-size stadium. And there were, just like the Olympic Games, every 4 years they celebrated the Pythian Games, and these were games that were second only in prestige to Olympia. So it was there was athletics there was drama there was the oracle, there was all kinds of things going on beyond just the god and his prophecies. Just another shot here. These wonderful Greek perfect blue skies, and some of the foundations of those treasuries and little alcoves where various city-states and individuals would leave their treasures along the way. Here's an omphalos on site, one of these little kind of acorn-shaped stones. This is the word that translates to belly button, to a navel stone. And so there's a few of these that are kind of more heavily decorated and ornate. They're kept in the museum just off the site, but they keep one of these plain ones, kind of reminding of that the role of Delphi as the center of the world. Here's the treasury of the Athenians. It's been heavily restored and rebuilt, but here you kind of get a sense of its scope. Looks like a little mini Parthenon, right? And they would have filled this with gold and treasure, as kind of a reminder to anybody who visited Delphi of the generosity of the Athenians, and a constant reminder to the god who is just up on the hill of the great generosity of the Athenians. It may have looked something like this. With that bright blue and red colors up at the top, Doric columns here, metape sculptures. Again, following really the same kind of architectural blueprint as the classical temples of the 5th century, like the Parthenon. There's lots of Delphi is a great site for epigraphers. That epigrapher is someone who studies kind of ancient inscriptions, and there's zillions of these all over the site. And so these kinds of things really help us understand what the site was all about. I show you just this one, just because it's very legible, and it gives us an insight of kind of how the site worked. So what this says here, this is a base, I believe, where a kind of a statue or a tripod once sat. All of kind of the gold and silver and bronze has long been lost and looted. Once the sanctuary fell out of use, it was attacked a number of times, looted, and so many of the great treasures that once sat there are just not there anymore. And this is a statue base where without a statue today. So this says in Greek, says Delphoi, which means Delphi, the priest of Delphi, the sanctuary of Delphi. Edokon, gave to Chios. This is the island of Chios, and so Chios refers to the people of Chios. So Delphi granted to the Chios, to the people of Chios, promantein. It kind of bleeds over into the next line, and promantein is the word which roughly translates to something like the right to consult the oracle. And so the idea is that the Chians, the people of the island, wanted to consult the oracle, so they offered this gift, and Delphi accepted the gift, and so they put this inscription to let everybody know that the gift above was kind of accepted payment by the Chians to consult the oracle. Here, kind of approaching underneath the Temple Mount, as you kind of rounded the bend, this is kind of the front of the temple, where if you were asking a question, you would have kind of walked up these steps up to the kind of the main doors there. And then here's kind of above the temple. Here you get probably the best picture I have, kind of gives you a sense of kind of the wild kind of beauty of Delphi. So here's the foundation of the Temple of Apollo. You can see not much left of it. A few stumps of columns over here. This is the front. This is the back, where the Holy of Holies, where the Pythia sat and shrieked forth her prophecies and maybe inhaled fumes from the earth here. But there you can see the valley below. Down here is where that Temple of Athena was. The main road kind of comes around the bend, which follows the ancient road, and you'd make your way up to the Temple Mount here, and there you can see just the wonderful olive groves and the kind of the crags of the mountains in the distance. It's really, the picture doesn't do it justice, so you're all going to have to come there with me one of these days. So one of the things that's been found, this is a stone that was taken off the Temple Mount, kind of a temple. The stone was kind of found back here, and but this is very like almost assuredly the stone on which that tripod sat. And so you can see kind of the three holes here and maybe kind of a supportive center post, and that supported the large bronze cauldron tripod on which the Pythia sat elevated in the Holy of Holies. They keep it off the site. You're not allowed to, like most places in Greece, tourists aren't allowed to kind of walk all over the foundation. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people come here every year, and so to allow people to do that would just destroy these things fairly quickly. But they took this off the site so people can kind of engage with the artifact a little bit more directly. Here's a vase painting which kind of shows you what I was just describing. So this is the back of the Temple of Apollo. Here's our Pythia. Here's our priestess, and here she has maybe a bowl of liquid that maybe she's gazing into, almost like a crystal ball, or she's drinking from. She has a sprig of laurel tree here as a symbol of Apollo. And here's going to be the priest sitting by waiting for her prophecy. And there you can see her elevated sitting in that bronze cauldron above the floor of the temple. Here's just one more artistic rendering, a little bit kind of over the top, but I like it, frankly, because it is over the top, looking straight at the site. But here, I like that all the colors, the golds and the greens and the blues and the reds and the pinks, and it just helps me imagine what approaching that sanctuary must have looked like. Coming from the sea or walking up the road on a sunny day with the sunlight just blasting off of all of these metal, bronze, and gold and silver objects. It must have been absolutely. I mean, if the site is awe-inspiring today for its natural location, combine that with kind of the civilizational element to it, it must have been absolutely jaw-dropping. Another side to Apollo is his as I have here, his role as kind of the luckless lover. I just use a few just to illustrate this. There's more stories than this, but it's interesting that Apollo, his role as an oracle god, is a god of poetry and purification. He's a god that's kind of soundly on the side of humanity and the city and civilization, but yet he has the side to him that seems to also illustrate that of his incompatibility with humanity. He has more luckless love affairs than successful ones. Famous ones like Cassandra, the prophetess who agrees to bear his child, but then she realizes, this is a very common trope, as the human being realizes, well, he's going to stay young and beautiful forever, and I'm going to grow old, and he's going to get tired of me. And she's absolutely right. So she reneges on her promises. No, I will not have your child. So he curses her with this famous curse that he says, I'm going to make you the greatest prophetess in all the world. Every prophecy you're going to get will come true. But here's the catch. Nobody will ever believe you. I mentioned Cyrene here. It's kind of a rare, that's the asterisk, a rare success story. Apollo comes upon Cyrene and finds her wrestling a lion, and apparently this really turns him on, and they have an affair which at least doesn't result in somebody getting cursed. Hyacinthus is one of the affairs he has with a young boy. There's lots of what we would call homosexuality, or in this case kind of bisexuality, in Greek literature. Hyacinthus is one of the young boys he has an affair with, and kills him with an errant discus throw, which is kind of a really kind of horrible, ridiculous, almost blackly comic way to go. Probably the most famous one is his. It's not really a love affair. It's just it's a rejection of sorts. That is typical of this kind of story for Apollo, of Daphne, and that's the one illustrated here in this famous sculpture by Bernini, Baroque sculptor in Italy in the 1600s. And so the story is that the story of Apollo and Daphne is in many ways is not really about Apollo at all. It's really more about Eros, or Cupid, and it's a story which illustrates a kind of the power of Eros, of lust, and how at the end of the day, all of the gods, particularly the male gods, have to bend the knee to Eros, or Cupid. And so Eros shows how in control of things he is by shooting Apollo with his gold-tipped arrow. Now we all heard of Cupid and his little arrows that make you fall into puppy love. We always see Cupid on the Valentine's Day cards. But in Greek myth, he wasn't a chubby baby, making you fall into romantic love. He was a dangerous, destructive deity, and you don't trifle with him. So he hits Apollo with his gold-tipped arrow, which makes him fall not in love, but with a kind of uncontrollable lust. And then he has another set of arrows, which we don't hear about on the Valentine's Day cards. He has a dull lead-tipped arrow, which if you're hit with that, it makes you fall into disdain. You want nothing to do with the person hit with the other arrow. So he shoots a Daphne with that one. And then Eros/Cupid sits back and says, watch what happens. So Apollo starts to pursue and chase Daphne through the woods. She sees him and she's horrified. She's running away. And the most famous version of that story comes from a Roman poet by the name of Ovid. And the clear subtext of that story is that if Apollo catches Daphne, it's not going to be a happily ever after. He's not going to sweep her off her feet to whisk her away to Olympus. No, there is going to be a rape. It's a very, very dark story. And so Daphne is fleeing not just because she doesn't want to be his lover, because she knows the violence that's awaiting her. And so at the last moment, she calls out to the gods and to her father for help, and they take pity and they turn her into a tree before Apollo can do violence to her. So you see her, kind of the bark growing up her body and the branches sprouting from her fingers just as Apollo gets there. And so Apollo is he's mortified at what's happened to him, and he feels terrible, and but he also wants to honor Daphne. And so Daphne in Greek just means it's the word for the laurel tree. It's the tree that she turns into. And so Apollo makes that tree his sacred plant. So overall, he's a very very complex deity. He's creative but destructive. He's helpful but dangerous. He represents kind of the best of humanity for the Greeks, supremely rational. But he also has this very dark side that seems to kind of mark an incompatibility with humanity. I think it was Aristotle that called him the most Greek of the gods, in that in kind of the best of him represents that restraint, that control of emotion that the Greeks prized in their logic and their rationality. Now, Artemis. So like I said, yes, she's the twin sister of Apollo, and broadly and thematically, she serves as kind of the natural counterbalance to his civilized ways. Apollo is the god of the city. Artemis is the goddess of the forest. She's the goddess of the hunt, and so as such, she's more unpredictable. She's more dangerous. In some ways, she kind of bears that color, like we saw with Circe. She's a Potniatheron. She's a mistress of animals, and the witch in the woods kind of character. So she's gods that are associated with nature and deep nature. There's a wariness about them that gods of civilization don't have, perhaps for obvious reasons. So like her brother, she is an archer. And again, her arrows represent kind of her dangerous, unpredictable quality. Here we see her in a famous story where this is really kind of the one main story where brother and sister work together, where they avenge their mother Leto, who was insulted by a woman by the name of Niobe, who said she was a greater mother than Leto was, because she had 6 times the number of children that Leto did. And Leto said to her children, "Avenge me, my name." And so Artemis and Apollo come down with their bow and arrow, and they kill all 12 children of Niobe. She reminds me in some ways of Athena, despite her association with nature and not the city. She is a virginal goddess. She does not traffic with men or women sexually at all, like Athena too. And she also kind of crosses what we might call kind of gendered boundaries. She, like Athena, dresses in like a male warrior. Athena is a huntress. Again, in antiquity, hunting was largely the province of men, and so there's kind of this Luke kind of high cut cloak that she wears, her hair tied up behind her, wearing a quiver with a bow and arrow. She has a masculine aspect about her that reminds me of Athena. There's an overlap there to some degree. Now, perhaps the most famous story associated with Artemis is a very disturbing one. It's her encounter with Actaeon. Powell mentions the story. So Actaeon, one of the tragic things about this story is that everything about Actaeon was dear to the goddess Artemis. He's a hunter. He spends his time in the woods. He's kind of he does what Artemis does. We would think that the relationship between Artemis and Actaeon would be like that of Athena and Odysseus. They see themselves in the other one. But this story is really about kind of the ultimate sacredness of the virginity of Artemis. So the story goes is that Artemis is in the heart of the woods, and she's with her entourage, and she's bathing, and taking a bath as she is in a state of undress, and that makes her kind of sexually compromised. She's vulnerable in a way that like we all are when being clothed as opposed to being not clothed. And Actaeon, to his great misfortune, stumbles upon this scene. He's not, in the versions that survive, he's not spying on her. He's not a peeping Tom. Like this painting suggests, he kind of just here and kind of pushes the curtain aside, like, what's back here? And so really through no fault of his own, he stumbles upon this very vulnerable goddess in this kind of sexualized state, unintentional sexualized state. And Actaeon is killed for it. In many stories, he's turned into a stag, and his own hunting dogs, Artemis turns on him, and he's torn apart by his own hunting dogs. Often when you'll see it in ancient art, they don't change him into a deer because they want to emphasize kind of the horror of his humanity being dismembered, and Actaeon is destroyed. It's a really dark story, and I think to any culture, it seems so unfair, and even the Greeks would have seen that it is deeply unfair. Actaeon does not, at any logical level, deserve this fate. But I think the idea is that the sacredness of Artemis's virginity is so sacred that a line, even if it's accidentally crossed, there has to be a punishment for it. It's a story that kind of emphasizes the sacredness and the power and the reverence for Artemis and her virginity and what that represents. Here's another kind of drawing of a vase painting here. Here you see Actaeon again kept as a man, being torn apart by his dogs. His dog here goes right for the jugular. And note that Artemis here has her bow and arrow drawn. And note that that she's almost wearing that cool passive resolve that her brother has. And here it's very unsettling. She's in this act of brutal vengeance, and it looks like just kind of a just another day at the office for Artemis. Now, one of the things that I want to mention this just because the Apollo book doesn't emphasize it all that much. One of the things that happens to many Greek goddesses and gods is that they undergo what we call a syncretism. Syncretism is a Greek term which just means a mixing together. And I'm not going to dwell on this because we only have so much time. But I do want to kind of remind ourselves that it's important not to kind of treat Greek mythology and the Greek gods and goddesses as if they kind of exist in this bubble and they're untouched by other cultures. And Artemis is one of these goddesses that becomes kind of something else as her persona kind of bleeds past the boundaries of the Greek mainland. And so Artemis became a very, very popular deity, in fact, a wildly popular deity in the city of Ephesus. Ephesus is on the southwestern coast of what we would call Turkey today. And it was kind of a crossroads of cultures. And it was there that this massive temple, you see kind of a drawing of the floor plan of Artemis, was built there. And it was it's on that list of one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. It was an absolutely massive temple. It was so big when it was completed that you could take the whole of the Parthenon and fit it inside the center room, like that Temple of Hera on Samos that we looked at in a previous lecture. Same kind of thing, massive, massive architecture. But the Artemis that was there was a very far cry from kind of that goddess of the hunt that we see on the pages of Greek myth. She was very much kind of an Artemis, almost merged with a kind of Aphrodite, a fertility goddess, a sex goddess. Here we see her. All these weird bulges all over her chest here are multiple breasts, which emphasize her fertility. The only thing that shows some kind of connection to the Artemis of the woods is that she's flanked here by these bodies. You can see they don't survive very well, of two deer here. But the Artemis of the Ephesians was very much more kind of a goddess of sex, procreation, lust. She was much closer to Aphrodite. But she seems to be kind of a mixture between the Artemis of the Greeks and maybe a fertility goddess of Mesopotamia, or what we might call the Middle East, now kind of merged together, syncretized, we would say, into something new. Now, the other seven wonders of the ancient world, except for the pyramids, which are the only ones that survive. There's really almost nothing left of this temple. I'll show you what it looks like today. It's pretty pathetic. But here's an artist's rendering of what it may have looked like at its height. Each of these columns would have probably been 60, 70 feet high, upholding this massive lentil stones and a roof, just huge, multiple columns across the side and the front. And we know that there were things like the ritual prostitution was big business here. To come here to pay a prostitute for sexual relations was one way to to enjoy yourself, but also to pay homage to this goddess that was associated with such kind of things. So this was a pilgrimage site for many years, and kind of a tourist site. People came, we know, just to simply see the temple. It was something to behold. This is all that's left today. Just down here, there's just kind of this swampy little valley. Out here, you can see these few scattered stones, which is all that's left of the foundation, which gives us some idea of kind of its range and its length and width and the like. The site restorers have kind of set up one kind of lonely, haphazard column here, at least to give the visitors a sense of what the site of the columns was. It's interesting. I've only been to Ephesus once, but when I was there, right at the top, there was a stork's nest. At the top of the column, which I think is a nice kind of little folkloric merging. Again, as you probably know, the stork in kind of folktale is the bird that brings babies when they're born, and so to have a stork as a symbol resting on a column of a fertility goddess is a nice little piece of kind of coincidental synchronicity there. Just another version of her, again, I'm not going to dwell on this, is she also becomes kind of merged with a couple of other goddesses known as either triple Artemis or triple Hecate. Here's one rendering of her. It's got three goddesses kind of snapped together back to back as one, and so it's a combination of Artemis, Selene, which is just the word for the moon goddess. Hecate was a goddess of the underworld. She becomes a goddess of kind of dark magic and unbounded places, an underworld deity. And so if you wanted to use magic to tap into the darker powers of the universe, you might invoke triple Hecate or triple Artemis to come to your aid. So kind of a prime, kind of obvious example of syncretism, this mixing together of many deities or a few deities produce something new. So she's sometimes also called the goddess of the crossroads, or she's called Trivia. Trivia literally means three roads, and so imagine each of these goddesses looking down the path where three roads meet, and she would stand in the middle. And it's those places that where roads would meet, where thresholds between outside and inside, the gate of a town, where two or more roads meet outside of town, the Greeks kind of recognize as being kind of unstable. As being unbounded. This idea that road A and road B meet, but where they meet in the middle is kind of both road A and both road B, but it's also neither road A or road B, and so it's unbounded. And so that unboundedness of those crossroads, in kind of the Greek superstitions, was a place of kind of spiritual slipperiness. It was a place where spirits that were maybe people who died but didn't have proper burial couldn't cross over with Charon into the next world. They were unbounded, and then they were therefore kind of stuck in those unbounded places. The only place they could belong was in the unbounded, these threshold transition points. And so there was lots of we'll see this with Hermes. Hermes is another god that was associated with those sites, and but a goddess like triple Hecate would be a goddess who would kind of look down each road of the crossroads, and so she has that unboundedness in her hands. And so if you wanted to tap into the power of that unspiritual kind of slipperiness, this might be the goddess for you. And that even plays over into lots of folklore around the world. This is not just a Greek thing of kind of the slipperiness of the crossroads. Maybe some of you have heard of this famous legend in Southern American folklore where about the guitarist Robert Johnson, who was a real person. This is one of two photographs that survives of him. There was a famous story that he went to the crossroads at midnight and he sold his soul to the devil there. And in exchange for his soul, the devil taught him how to play the blues like nobody else could play. And And so again, it's a very kind of American story, but it taps into the same kind of thing. Why would you go down? Will you go down to the crossroads? Well, why? Well, that's where you do black magic. That's where you meet, in this case, the devil. In antiquity, you'd go there maybe to meet Hecate, or some other dark demon, or as it were. And why midnight? Well, midnight is that liminal time. Midnight is both today and tomorrow. It's neither today or tomorrow. It's that transition point. And so it's that slipperiness where you're going to meet the dark powers that, if you play your cards right, might give you what you want. But it's also kind of one of those famous stories of be careful what you wish for. All right, that's plenty for today. Thanks for listening.